fantastic
Recording in progress.
3-day weekend. Welcome back. 3-day weekend. Welcome back. This is a work session of the Portland City Council. Today's date is June 1st, 2021. Colleagues, we as a city government are of course responsible for natural and built assets such as forests, trees, wetlands, traffic signals, trails, roads, buildings and facilities, pipes, treatment plants, and others, which cover almost 30% of Portland's entire land area. They are valued at tens of billions of dollars. They're vital to our economy and well-being, and they represent literally generations of investments. The policy and programs that we're talking about today could represent a reflection point in how we care for that investment for the long term, while supporting our core goals around climate action, economic prosperity, and unwinding historic inequities from all of these assets. So it's a big subject, a meaty subject. We're going to cover a lot in the next 2 hours, and so we'll get right to it. I'm pleased to introduce our Deputy Chief Administrative Officer, Carmen Merlo. Welcome and good morning.
Good morning, Mayor. Thank you. And good morning, Commissioners. For the record, I'm Carmen Merlo, the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer. And I also have the privilege of serving as the executive sponsor of the Citywide Asset Management Group, many of whom I'm pleased to have joining me today for this presentation and discussion. This cross-bureau collaborative works to advocate for best practices in asset management, educate peers and others on the benefits of asset management, and assist the city in managing our portfolio of physical assets. This group has taken on this role in addition to their core bureau duties, and the topics of today's work session are largely thanks to their efforts over the years. I'm also pleased to be joined today by BES Director Mike Jordan and Portland Parks and Recreation Director Adina Long. And Megan, may I have the slideshow up for council? I'll just give it a minute. Okay, hang on while all right, and let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so we have about an hour and a half with you today, and for our agenda, I want to accomplish 3 things. First, give you a brief state of the infrastructure report. Second, introduce and get your feedback on a citywide asset management policy that we'd like to come back to you later this year with for formal adoption. And third, provide you with an annual report on the Build Portland program. We've set aside some time at the end for discussion, but I really do encourage you to ask questions as they come up. Next slide, please. All right, well, let's just get into it then. So the city owns about $53.5 billion in asset infrastructure. This includes our roads, sidewalks, and pedestrian bridges, water and sewer pipes and pump stations, parks and natural areas, civic and performing arts buildings, and fleet vehicles. This infrastructure contributes to the health, quality of life, and economic vitality of the city, and the community depends on its reliability and resilience to live, work, and play. Together, water, environmental services, and transportation account for about 91% of city-owned assets. And the 5 asset categories shown here have the most asset management program maturity. However, even within these asset categories, different bureaus are at different levels of maturity. Next slide, please. Like many cities, Portland faces challenges maintaining the infrastructure that provides core city services, and the pressure on our infrastructure systems grow from heavier use due to population growth and density, climate change, and deferred maintenance. The known deferred maintenance gap for city-owned infrastructure is significant. We've called it about a multi-billion-dollar gap. And the current pace of incremental investment has not kept up with the growing demand of our aging infrastructure. Our estimates are inherently incomplete because they don't represent information on the deferred maintenance gap from bureaus with emerging asset management programs. However, we know this gap is growing every year, and this funding gap is particularly pronounced for transportation, parks, and our civic assets, which collectively make up about 90% of the deferred maintenance funding gap. So why is this gap worsening every year? Well, there are several reasons. First, we know that as assets age, their condition deteriorates and the cost to repair, replace, or refurbish them grows. A bureau's source of revenue and access to funds also plays a role. For example, BES and Water, both rate-funded bureaus with robust asset management programs, have a higher proportion of assets in very good or good condition. Their ability to embed asset management as part of their rates also has a significant impact on their ability to address infrastructure repair and rehabilitation at the optimal point before degradation. Conversely, PBOT, with an asset base similar in replacement value to both BES and Water, has more assets in poor or very poor condition, primarily due to inadequate and declining general transportation revenues. Both parks and civic assets, while smaller asset bases, are faced with a similar lack of and growing competition for funding. And then finally, the current condition of capital assets varies by asset and by bureau, depending on the maturity of their asset management program and the change in inventory of our assets over time. But even bureaus with mature asset management programs are still acquiring an understanding of their assets, whether it's because their infrastructure is buried underground and they can't fully perform condition assessments, or as we cultivate a more complete understanding of the risk, criticality, and interdependencies of our assets. And because the failure of one asset could have cascading impacts on others, we've moved beyond developing capital improvement programs around the question of how often will it break. Instead, we're more keenly aware of equity, environmental justice, climate, and resilience factors, and also consider who is impacted, what other infrastructure is at risk, how long will it take to recover, and how can we build back better? Next slide.
Director Merlo,
Yes.
Commissioner Hardesty has a question for you.
Yes.
Thank you, Director Merlo. My question is, how many billion? I know it's 6 billion for transportation alone. So can you give me a figure about our deferred maintenance? What is the total liability that we're facing?
Yes, Commissioner Hardesty. I understand from Emily Trich, the PBOT asset manager, and I want to maybe confirm that figure, but I understood the PBOT deferred maintenance about $4 million. We, as a low confidence estimate, again, because our information is incomplete, we assume about a $7 billion deferred maintenance gap.
Yeah, PBOT is significantly higher. It's in the billions of deferred maintenance that would actually put our streets in a fair condition.
And I do see that Emily put information in the chat, and she's confirming that it's about $4 billion for PBOT alone. Okay. So each year, the city underinvests in maintaining assets, which leads to more expensive repairs of infrastructure systems that in many cases were designed decades ago to service a much smaller population. The lack of adequate funding to maintain our infrastructure represents a significant long-term financial risk for the city and threatens to deprive future residents of the core services that make Portland one of the world's most livable cities. It is an intergenerational equity issue. The city must invest today in order to ensure the same levels of service are protected for future generations. Otherwise, they will inherit exponentially increased costs for a lower level of service. It's also becoming a current generation issue as the list of urgent project needs drastically outpaces the amount of available resources to maintain current service levels. Next slide, please. But there are things we can do now to mitigate risk, build resilience for the future, and balance levels of service with long-term reinvestment in the city's assets. And we can start with the adoption of a citywide asset management policy. With this policy, our goals are to prioritize asset management as a core business function of the city, support strong, consistent asset management practices across bureaus, and increase organizational and financial investment in asset management. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to BES Director Mike Jordan to elaborate a little bit more on the need for an asset management policy.
Thanks, Carmen. Next slide, please. I think I'm here to kind of put an exclamation point on this topic. I know that the council considers numbers of items every week that are considered urgent by both council and the community. But I would submit you will not talk about any item that is more important than this item is to the long-term health of the community. We at BES, as Carmen noted, manage about a third of the city's replacement value in assets. Those assets are in numerous classes, from 22-foot diameter tunnels known as the Big Pipe to pump stations. A good example is Swan Island, one of the largest pump stations in the entire state. Columbia Boulevard is a large industrial plant, basically, the treatment plant. And what we don't think a lot about is that we also manage a number of natural assets, drainage ways, stream corridors, wetlands, all of which contribute to the stormwater management of the city. But we're not in it alone. Our employees need buildings to do their work in. Our employees need vehicles to get around to do the various jobs they have across the city. And so taking a citywide approach to asset management not only helps bureaus that lack maturity in their condition assessment program and their asset management work, but it's an advantage to those of us who have a more mature asset management approach. And I will say, even with the maturity of the utilities, I can tell you that we know a lot more about certain classes of our assets than we do about others. We can't run a camera down a force main that's under pressure like we can with the gravity system. And therefore, we have to do a number of different calculations to try and understand what's the replacement schedule for a force main that's under pressure. Much the same problem that the Water Bureau has with their pipes that are constantly full and under pressure. So we've got a lot of things to do. For us at BES, the data that we get out of a robust condition assessment program and the processing of that data by doing risk assessment, risk of failure and the impact of failure when it does happen, and putting that data together gives us a way to look into the future and make investment decisions and prioritize those decisions across numerous asset classes. I would submit that the city council and future city councils are in the same position. They need good data to make good priority decisions, not only about the condition of assets, but the risk of failure and the impact if those do fail on the community at large. I would also say perhaps that, we talk about the fact that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And the second best time is today. I might submit to City Council that the same can be said for adopting an asset management policy. That, I guess I'll turn it back over to Carmen to continue.
Thank you, Mike. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So the asset management policy has been under development for over 2 years, but its underlying concepts are not new. The Citywide Asset Management Group has been meeting for almost 20 years, and in that time, asset management practices have been more widely embedded throughout bureau operations. Technical assistance has been provided to other bureaus, and the business case has been made for dedicated funding, including programs such as the Capital Set Aside and Build Portland, which you'll hear about a little bit later. So the policy codifies many best practices from throughout the world and establishes a structure for bureau and citywide continuous improvement. This group invested hundreds of hours gathering these asset management principles and aligning them so that they can be operationalized within the city of Portland. The policy is both prescriptive yet flexible by simultaneously setting minimum requirements for all bureaus while accommodating their unique lines of business and operating environments. The policy was also revised in response to feedback we heard from several bureaus and shared with core infrastructure bureaus to earn their support. It's comprehensive, but the expectation is not that all bureaus immediately meet all requirements. In fact, all bureaus, even water and environmental services, have work to do. The goal is continuous improvement using a common framework, ultimately attaining financial sustainable assets for the entire city. Next slide, please. So some key tenets of the policy include advancing the city's core values, assigning clear roles and responsibilities, promoting data-informed investment decisions for projects that balance service levels, risk mitigation, and cost, and setting an expectation for the continued growth and development of asset management core competencies. Finally, the policy provides greater accountability and transparency for infrastructure investments. Every year following its passage, with technical assistance from the Citywide Asset Management Group, bureaus will be required to report their status and progress with its implementation. Next slide, please. The city has been practicing asset management for quite a while, at least since 2002, but that practice has been somewhat uneven. Some bureaus have current condition assessments and ready access to enterprise asset management data systems that they use to inform equitable capital investment decisions, while others do not. The policy sets the framework to rectify that over time through continuous coordinated action. This policy does not dictate priorities, it doesn't provide funding, nor prescribe to each bureau how to practice asset management. What might take 10 people in one bureau could be far fewer in another. A data system that works for the utilities may be a little bit overkill for fire, but it is comprehensive in setting high-level requirements for business processes and organizational leadership in a manner that gets all bureaus pulling in the same direction. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can center equity in the implementation of an asset management policy. Sorry, next slide, please. So nationally, there are prominent stories reflecting the continued legacies of systemic racism and disinvestment in communities of color, places where brownfields and environmental contamination are common and access to parks and playgrounds, grocery stores, and transit is limited. One of the most extreme examples is the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Flint is a majority Black city where 40% of people live in poverty. But a more recent example that was brought to my attention is the failing wastewater system in the town of Mount Vernon, New York, which is just north of my hometown in the Bronx. Mount Vernon is a small town of about 68,000 residents where 65% are Black. This is another cautionary tale of how infrastructure systems are crumbling faster than cities can afford to maintain them, and where communities of color often bear an outsized burden. Next slide, please. But decisions about assets also have a racist history in the city of Portland, where a highway divided a once predominantly Black community. Tree cover east of the Willamette is half of what it is on the west, and the presence and condition of sidewalks are not evenly distributed throughout the city. In turn, neighborhoods in Portland will not experience the impacts of climate change equally. Communities with fewer trees and green spaces will be more vulnerable to heat and flooding, and those communities, both locally and nationally, tend to be places with low-income residents and people of color. So we need to unwind legacies of racism using the tool of asset management to support inclusive and equitable investments. These tools are both required in the policy, and in fact, we are pursuing a partnership with Portland State University to help us strategically center equity in our asset management policy so that we can change the disproportionate impacts of environmental and social injustice and the systemic underinvestment in communities of color. We do have some great examples in many bureaus already centering equity in their practice of asset management, using demographic data, targeted outreach, inclusive decision-making, and other practices. And we still have a lot of work to do. The profession is not racially diverse. We don't understand the most important opportunities for anti-racism and asset decision processes. We know we have disparities in both upkeep and provisioning of natural and built assets, and we don't have a forecast of the needs and services on track to be provided in the future, more diverse Portland. No one person can do all of this, which is also why the policy emphasizes an all-of-bureau approach and a coordinated citywide effort. It's not just an isolated program, but truly an overall approach. So I'd like to turn it over to Director Adina Long, who will give some examples of that community benefit from asset management.
Next slide. Thank you, Carmen. Good morning. My name is Adina Long. I'm the Director of Portland Parks and Recreation. I'm going to apologize in advance for any background noise during my remarks, as I am making investments in my infrastructure assets here at home. So I am here today as a spokesperson for other directors to emphasize the importance of these practices to the community, even though many of our policy elements occur behind the scenes. The playground in the picture on your screen is at Gilbert Primary Park. This park serves a neighborhood which has a higher than Portland average of youth, people of color, and lower income households. Through structured asset management processes, we uncovered the need and made this playground one of the few to get a full renovation funded by the 2014 Parks Replacement Bond. The old playground had many hazards, but no one had been advocating for it. It was the structured asset management process which uncovered and prioritized the opportunity for what is now a source of joy in the neighborhood. In BES, they use structured risk evaluation to quantify, prioritize, and prevent flooding. As you saw on the previous slide, and as Director Jordan indicated, our assets are interconnected. The public needs safe and accessible sidewalks to get to safe and accessible parks. Our workers need housing, work vehicles, and a place to work, roads, and everyone needs toilets. Also, pictured is a natural area and one of our frequent visitors at the restored Crystal Springs, top right. We, as a city, are responsible for natural assets, which provide shade, clean the air, clean the water, and provide respite for the community and for wildlife. In parks, I recently doubled down on our investments in asset management capability by including an environmental technician too, to help assess our natural assets among the many positions funded by the levy. I see the value. The community will too. The tools of asset management will help fight human-caused global overheating and manage these priceless natural assets for future generations of Portlanders. Now I'll turn it back to Carmen.
Thank you very much, Director Long. All right, next slide, please. Oh, okay. We're certainly happy to break here and answer any questions, or Mayor, if you'd like to go right into the Bill Portland section.
Well, I don't see any hands up at this point, so why don't we jump in, and then if people have questions, they can just jump in.
Sounds good. So at this time, I would like to introduce Geraldine Moyle. Geraldine is a strategic projects manager with OMF, and she is here to give you an update on the Build Portland program, which she project manages. So I will turn it over to Geraldine.
Thank you, Carmen. As Carmen said, I'm Geraldine Moyle. I am a strategic projects manager in the Chief Administrative Office. Next slide, please. So in the face of declining federal and state financial support, many cities, as we've heard across the nation, share the challenge of crumbling infrastructure and deferred maintenance. And when faced with more needs than resources, frequently the more urgent short-term needs are funded, leaving cities to rely too much on emergency repairs versus long-term maintenance, and risking intergenerational inequities as this maintenance is pushed out. And that is something that Portland shares with many cities. In 2014, the citywide funding options report received by council outlined a suite of options for closing the major maintenance and asset replacement funding gap, and highlighted that without substantial investment of resources to address this issue, the city risks higher costs and lower levels of service in the future. While we have made notable progress in identifying resources such as the parks replacement bond, the capital set aside, and gas tax revenue, it is not enough. And so in 2017, we established a bold initiative, Build Portland, to fund infrastructure renovations and repairs. Next slide, please. So as presented in the state of the assets earlier this morning, the city owns over 53 billion in assets with a major maintenance funding gap. Build Portland established a program focused on funding major maintenance and repairs to the roads, bridges, parks, and buildings that the community uses every day. Utilizing the returning revenue expected from expiring urban renewal areas, Build Portland is intended to close the funding gap and reduce intergenerational equity impacts over the next 20 years. And as we know, access to funding is challenging across all asset categories. So with Build Portland, the city aimed to focus on projects that address multiple needs, thereby leveraging our dollars for the most impact. Next slide. So a recap of Build Portland over the past 4 years. Build Portland was initiated with a council work session in 2017 and a council action that set the vision, investment needs, and framework for the program. In 2018, 7 phase 1 projects for a total of 50 million were selected and initiated, and general fund debt was authorized for financing those project costs. The 2018 City Council was cognizant about not committing future councils to future phases. And so therefore, each future phase of Build Portland needs to come back before council for approval for the funding and the projects in each phase. This also allows the council at that time to consider the highest and best use for returning revenue and the general fund debt capacity. And finally, the last time we were here to give you an annual report in 2019, we gave an update on the phase 1 projects and established a program administration and debt service funding. Next slide, please. So the first phase of Build Portland was approved in March 2018 with a commitment to, again, a $50 million initial program investment. 7 projects were selected from 25 projects that submitted for consideration, and the evaluation process considered how each project met criteria to maximize the city's return on investment, minimize risk, and consider equity in the priorities of the Portland Plan. There are 5 location-specific projects located throughout the city and 2 citywide projects. And so we'll provide you with an overview and a status of each of these projects. Next slide. The first is the Outer Stark Corridor improvements. So this is a section of Southeast Stark that's identified as a high crash corridor in need of both asset and safety improvements. Build Portland funds paving and signal upgrades and leverages Build Portland dollars for other funds to complete enhanced pedestrian crossings, corridor safety improvements, and the remaining paving costs. The total cost of this project is 18 million, with 10 million of Build Portland funding. Without Build Portland, the project limits would have been reduced and key infrastructure improvements would not have occurred, forcing our assets, especially the pavement and signals, to provide reliable service even further beyond their service life, increasing the risk of failure. Additionally, without this project and without the Build Portland funding, the ADA ramps would not have been improved. This project is on track to break ground in spring 2023. Next slide. The next one is the 42nd Avenue Bridge and Corridor improvements. This bridge is on a recommended emergency transportation route. It is currently weight restricted and has insufficient vertical clearance underneath and is not up to seismic standards. Build Portland is funding the bridge structure replacement and leveraging other sources to complete paving, sidewalk, pedestrian crossings, and bikeway improvements. The total cost of this project is 17 million with 3 million of Build Portland funding. Without Build Portland, this bridge replacement would not have occurred. PBOT used the Build Portland funding to serve as seed money, and they would not have been able to fix this weight-restricted bridge that is also a major low-height barrier for over-dimensional freight on Lombard underneath. They also would not have fixed a major pedestrian and bike gap. The project is on track to break ground in January 2022. Next slide. The Lents Town Center improvements. This section of Lents Town Center has been identified as a high crash corridor in need of both asset and safety improvements. Build Portland funds paving repairs and leverages other funding sources for sidewalk, pedestrian crossing, and bikeway improvements. The total cost of the project is $5 million, with $4 million of Build Portland funding. Without Build Portland, PBOT would not have done the project at all, and the pavement condition, which is less than 20 PCI, would have continued to deteriorate. The aging signal at 101st and Foster would not have been replaced, and new pedestrian crossings and ADA ramps wouldn't have been upgraded. The project is on track to break ground in July 2022. Next slide. North Lombard Town Center improvements. This section of the St. John's Main Street is a high growth area and a major transit route in need of asset and safety improvements. Build Portland funds pavement reconstruction and leverages other funding sources to complete crossing treatments, transit pad improvements, and curb extensions. It's also an opportunity for PBOT to retire an aged signal that no longer meets warrants and replace it with an all-way stop as requested by the community. The total cost of the project is $4 million, and $3 million of that is Build Portland funding. Without Build Portland funding, PBOT would not have done this project. The paving and the ADA improvements allow PBOT to add the pedestrian crossing improvements using other funds as well. This project is on track to break ground this summer in August 2021. Next project, slide. So the Mount Scott Community Center. So Build Portland is funding the seismic retrofit, roof and pool mechanical system repairs at this community center. Build Portland funding and work is being leveraged to secure additional funding to expand the community center to address the growing need for programming space. The total project cost is estimated to be $23.5 million, with $15 million of that in Build Portland funding. Without Build Portland, most of the structure would remain in its current condition with seismic and structural deficiencies, as well as the other deferred maintenance needs that would otherwise not be addressed. This project, including the expansion, is expected to break ground in fall 2023. Next slide. The final two projects in the first phase of Build Portland are two citywide projects where maintenance is occurring across the city. Build Portland is funding $1.5 million of ADA compliant corner ramp improvements each year for 7 years, improving accessibility of street corners citywide, and PBOT is prioritizing the work by risk and equity. Build Portland is also funding $480,000 of traffic signal improvements across the city each year for 7 years. Aging signal poles, span wires, signals, lamps, and controllers are unreliable and more likely to fail during crashes and weather events, and introduce substantial life safety issues. Build Portland funds for traffic signal system improvements focus on replacing the failed traffic signals. And again, PBOT prioritized this work by safety conditions and equity. Next slide, please. So phase one funding is based on the Build Portland intention to utilize the returning revenue from expiring urban renewal areas, which was expected to be available in substantial amounts in fiscal year 2022-23. In order to advance those projects, the 7 projects, in anticipation of those revenues, the phase one funding approach included a combination of short-term construction financing and long-term debt, both authorized by City Council in 2018, with the intention that the debt repayment timing would align with the anticipated returning tax revenue. Both the revenues and the debt repayment expenditures have been accounted for in the general fund forecast. The construction line of credit was issued in November 2019, and as we've seen, the construction of projects is anticipated starting this year and moving forward. Next slide. So now that we're a few years into the program and with all the phase one projects well underway, there are a few findings and lessons learned for consideration in future phases. First, in regards to funding leverage, Build Portland clearly provides needed local match and gap funding for projects that would not move forward without the program. Both Build Portland and Capital Set Aside, which also focuses on funding infrastructure maintenance and replacement, fill funding gaps for projects. Leveraging the two programs together should be considered to further address project needs and perhaps allowing projects to proceed sooner rather than waiting for the assembly of assorted funding sources. In regards to projects, we now know that projects need pre-design funding and advance notice to be shovel ready. Some of the projects selected for phase 1 had delayed start times as pre-design funding was needed to be secured. In addition, advance notice of when a phase 2 might be offered provides bureaus with time to get projects ready for consideration. And having more assurity on when projects will advance into construction phases provides more certainty for debt management regarding when lines of credit and bonds may or may not be needed, reducing the need to take on debt service ahead of when it is needed. Capacity-wise, projects do require bureau staff as well as professional services and construction contracting. So in robust times, the capacity of all three to deliver on a timeline is hampered by capacity constraints. So advance notice allows for bureaus to understand their capacity needs. Commissioner Ryan, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Jody. What would be helpful to me right now is this is really wonderful that we're on this topic of findings. I would love examples of each one, like what was a project where the funding leverage is a good example of where that occurred, one that didn't, and then same with number 2 and number 3. I tend to learn better from stories. So.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So all of the projects that we just went over, for the most part, every one of them used Build Portland to leverage other funding sources. So each project had a total amount that was larger than the Build funding or the Build Portland funding, and Build Portland came in to scoop that project up, lift it to the construction cost that it needed, and advance the project. So let's just use the Northeast 42nd Avenue Bridge replacement. So that was a $17 million project. $3 million of that is Build Portland, and PBOT has indicated that that project would not have occurred, right? The bridge replacement would not have occurred. Leaving that bridge, which is on the emergency transportation route, not up to safety standards. Mount Scott Community Center is leveraging the $15 million of Build Portland to do seismic upgrades and major maintenance, but also using those dollars to leverage the ability to get additional funding to do a community center expansion.
And the other revenue streams for those projects are from the bureaus?
The bureaus use a variety of funding sources. So for the Mount Scott Community Center, I believe Parks is using system development charges. For many of the PBOT projects, they're using either federal, state, or their own local dollars in regards to like gas tax revenue or dollars they get from other sources. There's definitely a need by having Build Portland have with phase 1 50 million. You know, there was a goal to leverage that as much as possible across multiple projects. That also came into play with having those projects be shovel ready. So in 2017 and 2018, when Build Portland phase 1 was selecting their projects, bureaus were scrambling to put projects in for consideration that were ready to go. And hence we found that some of those projects actually didn't have pre-design funding. We're getting in the queue, if you will, to get the funding so that they could use that funding as a gap or to leverage as a local match to provide the other sources. So they did have in 2017 and 2018, 22 projects were submitted, only 7 were selected. And if we were to move forward with a Build Portland phase 2, advance notice so that those additional projects and those who have now been put in the queue since 2018 have time to get ready would be necessary so that we can get into the construction phase sooner rather than later. Does that help?
Yes, it does help. And probably getting more information would be wonderful as well to my office.
Absolutely. We have an overview of each project with the breakdown of their funding. We're happy to provide that to your office.
Commissioner Hardesty has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Hardesty.
Yes, thank you. So it was $50 million initially that was identified for this backlog of maintenance. I appreciate hearing the story about just kind of the development. I think this happened just before I arrived at City Council. And it's a really forward-thinking plan. So thank you for the work that went into developing this. I am curious, and maybe this is really a Jessica Kennard question. Why you settled on 50 million? I expect there's a lot more dollars coming back in, and was there some conversation about the percentage of dollars coming back from urban renewal that would be invested in this backlogs?
That's a great question. I think Jessica is also on the line. I can set the stage for Jessica we were advancing these projects ahead of the expected returning revenue. So it had to do with our debt capacity and our appetite for advancing those dollars and committing those dollars ahead of actually knowing when what the actual revenue would be in 2022, 2023.
I can answer that question. So we wanted to get the program rolling quickly. 50 million was basically what we had available, given the rest of the budget that we had to balance that particular fiscal year. We knew additional revenues would come in through the sunsetting of the URAs. So that was actually a very reasonable and even a conservative amount, given where the projects were in terms of development, as well as the known revenues that were going to be coming in. So that's how that decision was made.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. So yes, I think if Director Kennard could actually give me a sense of what are the total anticipated returning revenues coming back to the general fund.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner, for that question. So we are in the process of updating it, and actually is something that changes with assessed value and changes with various commitments that the City Council is and has made related to the extension of URAs and other decisions related to existing urban renewal areas. So I don't have the precise figure. That's one of the things that we will be doing as a result of the budget note that was included in the budget is an updated forecast to our returning URA resources. It is in the tens of millions of dollars. And that's ongoing resource. And what's important here is as Geraldine pointed out, is that first tranche of $50 million. We settled on that amount because of our debt service capacity. We needed $50 million of one-time resource, which from an ongoing standpoint required substantially less funding from an ongoing standpoint to support from a debt service standpoint.
Thank you. That helps as well. Yeah, I think that it's good to see so many PBOT projects move forward, because each one of those are really poor infrastructures in those areas. So thank you. The last thing I'll say is that I realized from the time people submitted until like the first piece of dirt is moved, is like it takes about 2 or 3 years from the concept to actually getting the first piece of dirt moved. So that also says a lot about what's on the table for us around construction opportunities coming up. So I am also curious, have these projects already been advertised? So, I mean, are we out in the process of recruiting contractors for these projects?
So those that are,
the ones that were approved on the list that you talked about?
Depending on where they are, right? There are a few, there's at least one that is starting construction this summer. So that is a PBOT project. And
that's the ADA improvements, right?
So it's the ADA improvements and the traffic signals. Those are each year. And then the other one that's actually on track for this August is the Lombard Town Center. So PBOT will be following their expected requirements for procurement for those, and is likely to have already selected their contractor for the one starting in August. For those that happen in the next few years, I would look to PBOT and Parks to do the advertisement that they need to do.
Well, I would look to OMF to actually envision how we could be proactive so that we could, in fact, get ahead of the rush to find minority and women-owned contractors. I mean, I think this is a great example of if we are really thinking or forward-thinking, we would have a plan to let folks know that these opportunities are coming down the pike early. And so we wouldn't be having the excuse that we can't find people of color or women contractors, because we'd have a couple of years head starts at cultivating folks for these kind of major infrastructure improvements. And because we know that we have over $7 billion in deferred maintenance, I see this as a real opportunity to connect our values around improving our infrastructure and minority and women-owned contracting. So if the bureaus are all working collaboratively, I would hope that OMF wouldn't say, oh yeah, that's a procurement issue. It's not. It's all of our issues. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess I would say that's where program administration for Build Portland comes into play. With the initiation of a phase 2 and the lessons we have learned in phase 1, we can definitely be more collaborative and advance notice and preparation for future phase 2 projects to meet those needs.
Commissioner Ryan has a question.
Yeah, I'm back because I like what you just said at the end, Geraldine. I think I want to build on that. When we had a little dialogue earlier, I felt like you focused on 1 and 3, and I understood that. But I wanted to just hear some more stories about what we've learned in phase 1 about the timelines and the capacity. So, because when Commissioner Hardesty mentioned 2 to 3 years, that's what I was noticing. I just wanted to hear what we've learned from this first phase that we can implement for improvements for phase 2.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in regards to project timelines and capacity, what we learned was that bureaus need as much notice as possible, right? So if we are to initiate a phase 2, it would be helpful to know that now, this in 2021, so that bureaus, one, can identify those projects that are most ready to break ground sooner rather than later. That they are able to either obtain or use Build Portland for pre-design funds for those projects that aren't quite ready, that they are able to gear up, and we are able to notice our consultants and contractors ahead of time, as Commissioner Hardesty was saying, so that people know that there will be advertisements in 2022 or 2023 for construction contracts, and that they can also get prepared. We can start identifying those that may need assistance in being prepared and do a lot of outreach such that both our bureaus and our consultants are ready to go sooner rather than later. The pre-design and the work needed to advance project design into development and construction is significant for each project and therefore for each bureau. And knowing again sooner rather than later that we have a phase 2 and how much time bureaus may have to be prepared to submit and then advance those projects definitely impacts our ability to break ground sooner rather than later and the capacity that bureaus have to do projects. With that, they may submit only those projects, right, that are ready to go versus the multiple, the list that's longer than we know of projects that need funding, right? There were 22 projects that submitted for Build Portland and only 7 were selected. So knowing how much funding we might actually put into phase 2 would also be helpful in understanding how to, getting direction from council as to, do we put that into a fewer number of projects where fewer projects get a larger amount of funding so that they can move forward sooner rather than later without relying on other sources? Or are we spreading whatever that phase 2 funding amount might be across multiple projects and funding smaller gaps that then may require those bureaus to go and find other sources before they can advance a project.
Is there data that we could look at that would help us make that decision?
In regards to how much?
Well, basically what I heard from that is, do we pick a larger number of projects that we will be bundling and leveraging funds, or do we really prioritize our top 3 that we can get moving on sooner? And is that what you're saying?
So both approaches should be considered by council. Build Portland does have an advisory committee that can certainly advise on that. I guess I would propose that we take back that to that advisory committee that crosses multiple bureaus and has representation from various community committees as well, and get input on whether it should be a smaller number of projects with a larger amount of funding, or a smaller amount of funding across a larger amount of projects.
Yeah, they should wrestle with those tough questions and give us some concrete advice and some stories and some metrics that we can look at, for sure.
I also want to add just maybe one other thing regarding the project timelines and capacity. It's not just an internal capacity to manage all of these simultaneous projects, but also the capacity of our contractors. So I lived in Chicago for a while, and we had 2 seasons, winter and construction. And so we are competing with not just other jurisdictions, but the Port of Portland, schools, for many of the same contractors. So we're also at the mercy of their timelines as well, and that accounts for some delay in getting these projects off the ground.
I appreciate that, Director Merlot. That's exactly the kind of information that's just so relevant and important to hear. Thank you.
Can I ask just sort of a process question here? So when we created this program, it was created with the assumption that we would use the lion's share of the resources. I think the original proposal was $600 million over several decades for parks, transportation, and civic infrastructure. But we also wanted to make sure that there were adequate resources to maintain any future vision of both Prosper Portland and the Housing Bureau. And so I feel like we're approaching this backwards as we look at phase 2. I feel like we need to hear what is the vision for Prosper and the Housing Bureau, and what resources do they think they will need from the expiring URAs. That then gives us some sense of what the out-year capacity is that's available to bond for these projects. That would then help us decide what we have available in terms of our near-term priorities around infrastructure projects. So I can't do this backwards. I can't start with what are the projects I want and how do I want to prioritize them until I have an understanding of what's the bigger picture. So I just want to put that on the table today. And that's been my bigger picture question since 2017, as we've unfurled the banner of Build PDX, which, by the way, I love. I think it's terrific. And we approached the council with those specific projects in mind, with the understanding that those were projects that we could, in fact, do in the near term. And I appreciate this learning. We should absolutely take it into account for phase 2. But I don't want to just jump into phase 2 of Build PDX without understanding that bigger picture. Commissioner Mapson, Hardesty.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think I have essentially the same question that you have. And maybe I'll use this moment to ask staff to help me develop some intuition on this. In this space, one of the things I'm thinking about or trying to develop some intuition on is the trade-offs between or the return on investment for every dollar that we invest in a TIF project versus the return on investment for every dollar that we invest in, say, a Build Portland project. Certainly that's kind of going to shape how I think about the future of Prosper Portland, and also how I think about the future of Build Portland. I know that's a challenge. I know there are lots of unanswered questions there, but as we head into the fall and start to think about the future of Prosper Portland and our TIF districts. I hope that staff can come together with some sort of analysis that gives us at least a framework for thinking about those trade-offs.
Commissioner Mapps, thank you. We actually, as part of the budget note that was submitted in the approved budget, we are in fact expected to come back to council with a conversation around trade-offs as part of this discussion for Build Portland and returning URAs. So thank you for that. We do intend to do exactly as you've just recommended.
All right, great, thank you. I look forward to it.
So the mayor prompted a question for me, and the question around who decides what happens with the returning urban renewal dollars. It's my understanding that by statute, those dollars return to the general fund. So I don't know that I want Prosper telling me what their needs are. Their needs are for money. I don't know that I want the Housing Bureau telling me what their needs are, because their needs will be for money. I think as a council, the council has to decide how we want to invest these returning general fund dollars. I would be very concerned, as I expressed on the budget conversation, that we would have the two organizations with the most vested interest telling us what it is they need to be whole. I actually thought it was a council decision. When those dollars are expected to return to the general fund, doesn't the city council make the decision about how we invest those general fund dollars? So I'm a bit, I was tracking, I was fine, and then the mayor made his comment. So now I'm confused.
So let me help then. You are correct. All of this is general fund dollars. The opportunity that was created by Build PDX is for the council to make a long-term commitment to use, just as we did, we right now make a decision, for example, that certain dollars go towards infrastructure. When we have additional dollars that come in, we have a policy that half will go towards infrastructure needs. The council has never had the discipline that we have now with Build PDX, looking long-term at a new source of funding, new in air quotes, the ability to fund basically $600 million in infrastructure that we did not have previously. And the attempt for Build PDX, what I was trying to do is get council discipline around long-term funding of our backlog of infrastructure needs, as opposed to what would happen automatically. Automatically, what happens is these dollars go into the general fund, and my fear was we would not spend it on infrastructure, because infrastructure is boring. Nobody cares about infrastructure, and that's why it never gets funded, and that's why our backlog continues to grow year after year after year. So we saw an opportunity to do something different. With regard to the question around Prosper and the Housing Bureau, you are 100% correct that it is a decision of the council, but I can't decide, this is just me, I can't decide how big Build PDX is going to be if I don't have that other piece of the question answered. Now, they may ask for the sun, the moon, and the stars, and we may tell them, no, you get the stars, but not the sun and the moon. And that's a conversation we must have as a council, and I very much look forward to it, but I cannot separate that conversation from this one, I guess is what I'm saying. I sort of need to know, where is the landing pad? Where do we think as a council we want the landing pad to be with Prosper and the Housing Bureau? Then that helps me decide how much capacity is actually available over the next 30 years for Build PDX. I'm still as committed to Build PDX as I ever was, maybe more so. But now we have, we don't just have a theoretical conversation in front of us about the Housing Bureau or Prosper. It's becoming very real and very urgent. And when we originally approved Build PDX, part of my ability to get it through the council was the understanding that we would have this conversation about housing and Prosper, but we still haven't had it. And so that's my frustration, is it's not 2017 anymore, it's 2021, and we still haven't had that conversation.
Thank you, Mayor. That helps. That helps a whole lot. And I couldn't agree with you more. I guess I just don't want Prosper and the Housing Bureau telling us what they need. I think what we should know is like how many funds are available and how do we as a council think we should be investing those funds coming back to the general fund.
Yeah, I'd just like to know the options, like three scenarios would be, anything would be helpful. I just can't do this in a vacuum. My brain just doesn't work that way. Commissioner Maps also had a comment or a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have I think a wonky budget question probably for staff. So it was my impression that when TIF funds expire, they return to the general fund, but some portion of those were set aside or put in a capital set aside account. Is that correct?
Not exactly, Commissioner Maps, and I'm gonna also maybe defer to Jessica, but so the capital set aside is distinct from urban renewal area funds. What we've said was for each budget year, any remaining unspent general fund dollars, at minimum 50% would have to be used for capital set aside in three categories: parks, transportation, and emergency preparedness. So that is completely separate from the urban renewal area funds.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, and I can just add to that, Commissioner, that so you're right. Essentially, what happens when our urban renewal areas expire, the resources from those property tax assessments come back onto our assessment rolls for all of the jurisdictions that receive property tax resources. So it just becomes part of our general fund revenue, and we can forecast out how much we anticipate to come back based upon assessed value and based upon when we anticipate these districts to be expiring. But it just comes back into the general fund, and so we're trying to preempt that when we know that that's happening, with a conversation about how do we want to be intentional around this new resource.
I appreciate that clarification.
So if we could have the next slide, please. This is everything we've all been talking about. So anticipating the conversation that you've all just had, we would note that, again, when the program was established, while phase one was secured, future phases of Build Portland require your approval, not only for the funding, but also the projects in each phase. So as you consider what to do with those returning tax revenues, we would encourage you to consider Build Portland as a priority use for some of those funds. And then also, as we've been talking about, consider confirming the intent to initiate phase two in advance of the funding determination so that we can allow time for bureaus to prepare project applications and to advance that program administration that we were also talking about to gear everyone up capacity wise. The sooner we know Build Portland phase two will move forward, the sooner we can get everyone prepared to have those projects get in the ground sooner rather than later. And with that, that is the end of our presentation.
So Geraldine, did you anticipate, where did you anticipate phase two beginning?
So back in 2017 and 2018, a significant amount of returning tax revenue was anticipated starting in fiscal year 22-23, which is next year. We also had this goal with all projects being on track, that the phase one projects, you can think about it as 7 projects over 7 years with $50 million. So we are about almost to that 7-year completion as well. Initiating a phase two now in 2021 in anticipation of those returning tax revenues, whether that be next year or the year after, would be on track with what we were projecting.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Commissioner Maps had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if staff could help me think about how Build Portland would look different if we had a modern citywide asset management program.
I think one of the things that we'd be doing right now is not taking care, well, we'd be a little bit more innovative in new infrastructure as opposed to taking care of old ones, right? So if we really did have a mature asset management program, we wouldn't need to spend so much kind of repairing and rehabilitating old infrastructure. And we could do some pretty innovative things that when we build back better, we can add for seismic resilience and talk about climate change and make sure we've got, digital equity. So it's more about what added capacity can we put into the system as opposed to repairing an old system that was designed decades ago.
Thank you. That sounds like a good thing.
I'll also add, this is Shannon Reynolds from BES, that it provides, it helps lay the strategic vision. So Mayor Wheeler, you were talking about not making decisions in a vacuum. And that's the point, right, of the citywide asset management plan, is that you're able to collaborate across bureaus to understand that the strategic priorities more readily, and can offer that strategic perspective to make those wise investment decisions with city funds.
This is Maddie with DAM. I would add on to what Shannon has said. So, part of our challenge right now is with an unequal design of this system, a lot of the bureaus don't even know what they need to invest in. So if you had a mature asset management program, you would be able to see not just risk apples to apples from infrastructure based to infrastructure based, but also have that value framework in place that I think you guys are talking about. What do we want to invest in versus not? So you'd have a systematic approach to assessing risk, to assessing value, and then that would help you build the methodologies required to know where to put cash and where not to put cash. And at this point, we're all in very different states of being. And my main concern, as a civic asset owning bureau, is that I can't even tell you what risks I have. I kind of know, but we're all going to find out about them when the building collapses. So that's how we're going to figure it out. So I think a more methodical approach would be one of the primary benefits of having a more mature asset management methodology citywide.
Thank you for those responses. And if I can ask one more question, I can be quiet for the rest of the day. Staff has convinced me here, having a modern asset management program, I think citywide makes a lot of sense. Where are we in this project? What are the timelines? And what's council's role here? And after this, I'll be quiet.
No, thank you for the question, Commissioner.
We don't want you to be quiet, Commissioner. Perhaps you're asking great questions.
I know Commissioner already has her hands up. I kind of butted in line, but I apologize for that. But we'll just get this out there then.
So today we really wanted to introduce the policy to you and understand some of your questions and concerns. We're going to go back and see whether or not we do need to make any updates to the policy, but we do intend to come back to you with an ordinance to adopt the policy. I would say sometime later this summer, Commissioner. So that's the next step.
And I guess I didn't tell the entire truth. It seems like PBOT and Parks in particular are kind of struggling with asset management, I think is something that I'm hearing. Where are they in this? Do we have to go through this whole process for them to move forward with a more modern asset project? Or is that a commissioner in charge decision? Or is that this process decision?
Adina or want me to defer to you for that question?
I believe we have Chris Silkey on the line.
Yeah, hi, good morning. My name is Chris Silkey. I'm the Asset Management Program Manager for Parks and Rec. So first, I think the bigger concern are the bureaus that may not even be represented in that pie chart. So that's also something to have as a concern. For parks, I'd say we're fair along the ways towards a full mature asset management program, but every bureau has work to do. We don't have a solid understanding of how natural assets should be evaluated and compared when you're comparing built assets to natural assets. One of the advantages of the citywide asset management group is we've been meeting for years and we've been sharing best practices. We've been comparing notes and we've been providing technical assistance to one another. So that's really been an advantage. What this policy does is actually formalizes it and requires that approach of everyone. So that's one of the advantages of having the policy, so that we're all steering in the same direction.
Commissioner, I'll just add on behalf of OMF, we are probably the least mature of the bureaus. In fact, finally in this approved budget, we got funding to have a system of record, which we didn't even have previously. So our own program is in dire need. So I'll chime in for OMF.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but let this council know what we can do to help you move forward.
So this is Shannon Reynolds again, and I think one of the questions that was posed was, what is the city council's role in this? And I think, at least from my perspective, I think this is where the budget comes in, and understanding that we have to make trade-offs if we don't have enough budget to invest in deferred maintenance or in infrastructure or in natural assets or in community service facilities. And so the question then becomes, what service levels do we lower? And understanding those trade-offs is really important for you as council members. I think when you're making budget decisions on infrastructure investments, and not just infrastructure, but in investments in general. And some of those level of service trade-offs are really centered around equity, right? So I think it's really important to understand what we're talking about here is linked to the budget, and where all of these things kind of intersect, and the outcomes that come of it are really important for you all to know at that level, those intersections.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Maddie, I would also argue a role of council or something that would benefit us is to ensure that council understands that infrastructure is years in the making, right? So it doesn't start with shovels in the ground. It starts with, you can back up that pipeline from the portfolio analysis of what needs to be made and the pre-design work all the way to the risk assessment work and the data systems that inform that risk assessment work. So infrastructure is probably 5 to 10 years out before you get a shovel in the ground. And I think one of the challenges with infrastructure, I actually do think infrastructure is exciting. Good infrastructure planning is what makes it's what makes the educational pipeline. It's what makes contracted workforces happen. It's what makes equity happen in jobs and in service provision. It's incredibly exciting. I think the reason people don't invest in infrastructure is actually because it's durable. So you can take a hit and then another hit and then another hit before anybody finally notices that it's about to fall down. And then we're all in a pickle. So I would say that I would like to see council commit to that 5 to 10 year vision. That's before a project happens. The organizational infrastructure behind that is the 20 to 30 year vision. And to Carmen's point, we just got an asset information system approved in the budget. And yeah, thank you. But we have, probably $1 billion asset base, and I'm guessing probably 500 million in deferred maintenance, but I don't even know. So I'm way before having a project for you. So that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. And that's what council needs to do, is to be educated in the cool stuff about infrastructure, but also how it works.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate those responses.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you. Yes, I appreciate the responses you just gave as well. And so I think one of the challenges, of course, with infrastructure maintenance is, I think, as the mayor said earlier, it's not sexy, right? It's not new. You don't have a ribbon cutting, right? People don't take pictures and talk about you for generations when you're fixing roads. But I guess for me, the fact that we have $4 billion in maintenance backlog and transportation did not happen overnight. And as I looked at the chart as to how that maintenance gap grew and grew and grew, what I realized is that as a council, we're looking at today and into the future, but not looking at decisions that were made 10 years, 20 years ago that now are coming back to bite us. And so as I've been listening to the conversation today, I think about the long-term commitments, financial commitments that the city is invested in, either through lawsuits right? Like the Columbia Slough and other environmental cleanups that we are responsible for. I think about the fact that the 4 billions only brings us again to fair, right? Not good roads, just fair roads. I think about whether or not there's opportunities with the jobs package that may make it out of Congress one day with some dollars for investments in either undoing previous harm around transportation infrastructure or investing in new thinking around how we move forward. I think that the push and pull for council is really keeping commitments from the past or things that actually, quote unquote, nobody's really responsible for, right? Like if the general fund is not, the general fund has to be balanced. And so we have what we have. And so priorities become whatever the new shiny thing is as compared to the infrastructure that we already own and have to improve. So it makes me wonder how many of the city's buildings are URMs that would fall apart in an earthquake. It makes me think about whether or not we have a real sense for really how much deferred maintenance the city of Portland really has. I think you used a $7 billion number, but if I'm 4 billion by myself and I'm 30%, I think that number is radically under disclosed. Even with your own assets and OMF, right? I think that number is radically under. So I think the mayor's point about, having that conversation about Prosper and Housing Bureau is necessary, but it cannot happen in isolation of all the deferred maintenance and all the obligations that we have coming down the pike. So I'm feeling like there's a bigger conversation that must be coming because, I don't want to just talk about Prosper and the Housing Bureau's future if I don't also have in that same conversation what the price tag is for all the stuff that we are obligated to do over the next decade or 20 years. And that's my big concern. My concern is it still feels like we're having a conversation in isolation as compared to looking at the whole full picture.
Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. This has been a great conversation, but I want to just pick up on where the dialogue is right now. When you showed us the phase 2 plan, I recall seeing funding and timing, but to the dialogue we're having right now, we really want to know what we've learned from the past decade, and then we calibrate our priorities constantly. So we just stay current with what we're learning. And so I didn't see that as part of the next phase. And of course, I'm just trying to figure out what our role is. So I really appreciate the earlier reference to what you really need from council when you have these presentations. Like, where do you need us to focus? How can we be additive? And it does take some really honest feedback on what you've learned. And please tell us where we made mistakes. I don't know about you, but I sure make a lot of mistakes, and it's the only way I learn how to move forward. And I feel sometimes in these sessions, we don't get to that part of the matter. So it's hard for us to figure out how we can be additive so we can move forward. So I was happy to hear about that advisory council that you mentioned. And I do hope that we can get all that information so we can help make this a priority and keep it at the top of our mind. Thanks.
Mike, Director Jordan. I'm sorry, Commissioner Maps, then Director Jordan.
I'll defer to Director Jordan.
Thank you, Director Jordan. Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Commissioner. This is a great conversation and long overdue. The layers of strategic thinking that the council can employ in making all the decisions that you've alluded to this morning is grounded in this asset management system. Whether it's the condition assessment of the existing infrastructure, the drivers behind why we have it in the first place. And I will mention that we haven't talked about, and that is the public's investment in the community is actually the minority partner in investment across the whole city, right? We're probably 20 to 25% of the investment across the entire landscape. And the private sector is about 75% or 80% of that investment. If we can strategically use our public investments to leverage the majority partner into making the kinds of investments that better the community, then we really win. Geraldine talked about leverage. You want to talk about leverage? One of the component parts of making decisions about what to invest in and where to invest in it is leveraging the majority partner. I'll give you an example. I gave this to Commissioner Mapps once, and Commissioner Ryan, we talked about this. The Green Line, we spent about $1.2 billion putting the Green Line in place. Great piece of transportation infrastructure, but it's in the wrong place. We put it in the I-205 corridor when it should have gone down 82nd and would have leveraged billions of dollars of private investment in an area of the city that desperately needs it. And so we made a good transportation decision, but we weren't strategic about the private sector partner and how they would have invested had we moved it just a few blocks from where it is. Now, it's harder to do that than for me to say it, but think about how much better decisions we can make if you have a lot more data about our infrastructure. And that's really the big payoff for you is to be more strategic when you make these decisions.
Well said. Commissioner Mapps, and then Emily.
I'll defer to Emily.
Emily? Morning.
Thanks very much. This is Emily Trich. I'm PBOT's asset manager. I've really enjoyed the conversation today and agree wholeheartedly with the remarks of my colleagues. I just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of, as we've heard Secretary Pete say and others, that we are really at this pivotal tipping point here. This is a key time to be thinking about infrastructure across the nation, but also in Portland. And Portland, from the transportation perspective, we have 50% of our streets are failing or in failed condition. We have nearly half of our bridges are reaching the end of their useful life. This is really an opportune time to be not just act on our values, but be forward thinking about how we plan to deliver on the service commitments to Portlanders in the future. And to Director Jordan's remarks, the infrastructure that we enjoy today do represent decades of investment by Portlanders. And so it's in our best interest to manage that investment and also to carry it forward so future Portlanders can enjoy it. And I'm probably saying things that you're well aware of, but we have a bunch of examples of some real transformative investments that we can demonstrate value to our communities through Build Portland. And so we rely heavily on this resource, and I really appreciate your consideration.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks.
Commissioner Mapps, I think you've deferred and deferred and deferred. Now we all want to hear you.
That was such a good note to end on, but there is, I think, one wrinkle here that I find personally interesting in the asset management front, and I was going to invite staff to maybe explore this area because I've heard it indirectly referred to a couple of times. When we talk about asset management, I think we tend to think about counting how many feet of pipe we have or how many cars we have. But I know as the commissioner in charge of water and BES, we're beginning to think of asset management also in terms of just kind of keeping track of the open spaces and natural places that we have. And I feel like that's almost once you reach a certain level of maturity in asset management, I think that's the next question. I was struck, I think, when Chris at Parks said that's one of the issues they're struggling with too. And number one, I just wanted to make sure I took a moment to make sure that BES and Parks were talking about this interesting challenge. And I also wanted to invite staff, if they have any insights to help council think about this non-obvious aspect of asset management. What does it look like and how should we think about it? And where are we on it? And I don't know, Mike? Go ahead,
Yeah.
Director Jordan.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. And Chris made a great point. It is, for us, we're probably one of the more mature asset management groups and have a large mix of really hard assets and green natural assets. And we struggle because the metrics of measurement for risk and impact of failure, all of those things that we do a really good job between, a mile of pipe and a pump station and a process at the treatment plant. We do a pretty good job of being able to compare those things, but we struggle yet with doing direct comparisons with natural assets. And that causes us to gravitate toward investing in the hard stuff because we know a lot about it. And so we're even struggling with that trade-off. And that's one of the things I think is kind of a next level question for us.
Thank you.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand, so I'll just physically raise it. But I just want to emphasize that exactly what you've gotten to is the methodological conundrum that is asset management right now. And that's the value of something called like a value framework. I just want to commend the CBO through the capital set aside. They have been trying to compel a methodological approach to assessing the value and risk of things. And it matters, right? So cost of carbon is an environmental risk stream that we are all experiencing. And so the question should be, as someone who runs fleet, should we be buying a really nice green dump truck? Or should we be instead investing in a park, right? And currently, we don't have a way to compare those two investments if you're trying to look at a broader spending portfolio. So methodological discipline is pretty important in asset management, and trying to make sure that you have every infrastructure owning spending entity looking at things in a relatively apples to apples way. So at the very least, if you override the economic decisions, you know why you've done it. And so that's one of my concerns, is that that discipline it's coming about, but it hasn't been institutionalized yet. And that's what I would like to see happen through the asset management policy. It's what I would like, I'd like to see council really focused on organizational development. Like, we just got our first analyst in fleet like a year ago. So how do you even do any of this if you don't have a data system or analysts? So building those foundations are what's required to then do these higher level analyses that really matter when you're talking in the billions of dollars. $100,000 on an analyst is nothing when you're talking about billions of dollars of investment. So yeah, these are great topics, and I would say ripe territory for an asset management workshop that's in more depth with council.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty, and then Doug, and then Shannon. Oh, yeah.
Hate to stop the conversation from moving, but for Director Kennard, I think it would be helpful if we could have a list of current liabilities, like whether it's the Columbia Slough cleanup, the levee project. I mean, there's just so many things that are in the future that we have an obligation for, that it would be helpful. The list that we had today was really helpful, but it would be great to know, like, what are all the commitments that we have financially in the future. Because again, it's mind-boggling to think that we have not actually collectively had that conversation about what are the liabilities that we are confronted with. So if you could get a list of that for us with the total dollar amount, I think that would be helpful as we continue to think about our conversation today. the other thing is that I forget who said it, but somebody was talking about, let's not forget this moment. We are at a conveyance of racial equity demands and climate mitigation demands. And my fear is that if the city operates as the city has always operated, we will just continue to repair and do things the way we've always done it, as compared to thinking about. I think it was Mike that talked about the green line, right? If it had come a couple of streets over, how much more economically beneficial that would be. I think we're at that same moment again when we think about what's possible at the National Transportation Administration, what's possible as we think about how are we going to build a more equitable city coming out of this pandemic. And so we have to think about all of that in the context of the limited resources that we have here, but what the potential could be at the federal level and other opportunities that may come down the pike as we get into recovery. It's really important that we have an opportunity to look at the full picture of where we are now, but more importantly, a bigger picture of where we could head. I heard Fleet talk about, should we be buying green trucks? Yes, you should be buying green trucks because we should not be actually contributing to greenhouse gases, right? That should be a given. And I actually thought that was a policy or would be a policy at the city of Portland, since we are committed to climate mitigation, right? And I know with PBOT, having a bureau that is reliant on both fossil fuel tax dollars as well as parking fees is why we're compelled to be looking for other revenue sources that will help us improve our streets and continue to do the work that PBOT does. So thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Harsey. Doug and then Shannon.
Good morning. I'm Doug Stewart with the Portland Water Bureau. Haven't heard much from us today, but I've been one of the key drivers in helping to put this policy together and bring it to council. It sort of warms my heart that we're actually at this point. It was several years of work to pull this together, but I guess the comment that I would like to leave the council with is one of the underlying tenets of our asset management policy is to really get the city to start thinking more about life cycle costs as we approve projects. It's certainly not just about, let's spend the $800 million to build a treatment plant. And, at the day you commission the plant, we're done spending money on it, because that's not reality. The reality is when you approve projects, there's a life cycle cost stream that comes along with each of those projects that has to be funded. Back to Commissioner Hardy's comment, how did we get to this point where we're billions and billions of dollars behind in deferred maintenance? Is because I think a lot of us have lived in the paradigm to this point of, we've approved this year's budget and we can build the next new set of infrastructure, but for everything that we continue to build and put into the ground in the city, there's ongoing costs that have to be funded and have to be understood. Count the cost for every project that you approve, because it's not just about the initial construction cost. Thank you.
Shan.
Thanks. I'll just build on Doug kind of touched into what I was also going to share. So thank you, Doug, is that it's not just about deciding to invest in something and what those priorities are, but the continued investment. So like the life cycle costs that Doug very articulately discussed, but it's also important to think about how the improvements and the investments are implemented. And that really touches on, in my opinion, the equity component. So how do we go out to the community and do our construction for sewer lines? How do we ensure that the timing is right, that we've engaged them enough to understand how that's going to impact them, just to make that improvement as one example. But I think that's where this asset management policy really forces us to ask those questions. And I think, the life cycle cost is a huge component of that. And it has that, it provides the framework to look at not just our capital improvement stream of investments, but also our operational dollars, the resources we need from a staff perspective to actually prepare projects like Commissioner Hardesty was mentioning earlier, so that they're shovel ready. And that's true for all bureaus. All bureaus struggle with that. So I just wanted to highlight that and emphasize that along with Doug. And then if I could jump quickly back to the open and natural space comment, there is this other layer of complexity in that we don't own things like streams. Nobody owns them outright. So, BES doesn't own a stream, but we're heavily reliant on streams to provide conveyance services to our community. So it's in our best interest to invest in them in such a way that it actually adds value to our community. Increases property values, makes it so that people want to come and live and invest in our community. And so I think the difficulty is also in understanding what role each of the bureaus play in investing in those natural assets. And to what degree do we all need to be investing in those based on the commitments we've made from a strategic perspective as a city, but then how does that translate to the services we collectively provide and how those services are provided to the community through assets. So it's not just about the assets, it's the service that they're providing to the community and how do we collectively invest in them from a natural asset perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd actually hoped this would go on for 2 hours. It turns out we only have an hour and a half, which means we're about 5 minutes over. Obviously, this is not the final word on this subject. This was a great work session. I really, frankly, enjoyed and appreciated the questions and the comments. And I love the fact, colleagues, that a lot of our qualified staff engaged in this conversation. That for me was somewhat unusual and greatly appreciated. And I hope that sets a high bar for future work sessions. Well done. And yes, Maddie, you're right. Infrastructure is exciting. I've always said it's sexy as well. So we'll leave it there. Colleagues, thank you. To be continued. We are adjourned. Thank you, Carmen and your team. Great presentation. Well done. Thank you.